Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin, and I'm your host, and we have a returning guest, friend of the show, Mr. David Horowitz. Folks, let me tell you something. He's put out a new book, I Can't Breathe, How a Racial Hoax is Killing America. This brother did it again. New York Times best-selling author and just unquestionably one of the great intellectuals of our time. Mr. Horowitz, thank you for your time with me today. I really appreciate it. And what I'd like to do, Mr. Horowitz, you wrote an article here, I think it was published in October 5, Why I Wrote I Can't Breathe. And what I wanted to do is to read excerpts from that article and then have you comment.
Sure.
We'll do that 3 times. Then at the end, as you know, I'm out of Louisville, Kentucky, and I can't help myself. We got to talk a little bit about Breonna Taylor. Yeah. So let's go ahead and get straight into it. The first comment here, since I was a child and marched in my first political demonstration on behalf of civil rights, a central concern of my life has been the equality of all people. As a Jew, I was aware of the painful effects of prejudice, and as the child of communists, I was involved in the left's effort to denigrate the United States and weaken it for its enemies by exploiting injustices to Black Americans. As an adult, I came to learn that the left did not care about actual Black people or their welfare. It was only interested in using them as battering ram against their country. Could you give me a little bit more on that?
Well, yeah, I wrote an article actually, which is up on the web. It's called Anatomy of a Lynching. And it's about this the most famous lynching, which Billie Holiday wrote a song about called Southern Trees Bear a Strange Fruit. So it's the people will know just from the photograph. It's a crowd of white people and 2 guys facing the camera point to 2 Black bodies hanging from the trees.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about this story is, well, first of all, what is a lynching? A lynching is when people don't trust the criminal justice system to bring justice. They take the law into their own hands. So it's always first they want a verdict. So these 3 young Blacks were sprung out of jail by the lynch mob. They had already been arrested for a brutal murder of, the claim was that they had murdered this young man and raped his girlfriend. But what was fascinating to me about this particular lynching was that there was a 3rd guy who did not get out of his car. They were all 3 in a car. Did not get out of the car and kill the white guy, the young white guy. And somebody in the crowd, I don't know if they were there or what, spoke up for him. One of the lynch mob people spoke up on his behalf. And so the lynch mob did not kill him. They strung up the 2 guys who were responsible for murdering and robbing this young man. I actually heard this on National Public Radio, if you can believe it, and was an interview with him, that he went on, he served a 5 to 7 year sentence for being an accomplice, since he was in the car with them when they drove to the site where they murdered, or where they hung these 2 guys. He spent 5 to 7 years in jail, and then he formed a national civil rights organization. And you can find this, I think you can find it by typing into Wikipedia, lynching in Indiana. So this guy, it showed, I mean, that the caricatures, look, obviously lynching had a huge racial element, and obviously it's a horrible thing. But it shows that life is a lot more complex than all of these political myths around it. Because here were people in the lynch mob deciding that this guy was innocent and shouldn't be strung up along with his companions. And I told the story because it came to my attention as a young person. I was maybe 10 years old. The Russians were murdering, but executing the leaders of the East European communist parties, who were all Jews, because the communists were Jew haters. And they put out a book called We Charge Genocide, and it had this picture of the lynching. And Paul Robeson, who was my hero as a young leftist, had written an introduction or whatever, and they brought this petition to Congress to indict the United States for lynchings, but they weren't really interested in lynchings. They were interested in covering for the Soviets who were murdering Jews in Eastern Europe. It's a very interesting article called Anatomy of a Lynching, but what it does is it tells you how political these things are and how you can't trust what they look like at first sight. You have to really take a look at them. But one of the reasons the communists were as successful as they were was, the plight of Black Americans, cried out for justice. So the cause, as it was portrayed, was very good. The cause as it was enacted was not so good. But it remained, I was 10 years old when I marched in this march, 1948. I was 9, actually. So it made a deep impression on me. And I wound up later in life supporting the Black Panther Party, another mistake. I raised a lot of money, over $100,000, which would be a hell of a lot more money now. Yes. I bought a Baptist church in East Oakland and turned it over to the Panthers. It's shameful what I did. I remember the minister, they had been overtaken by the inner city, so all the neighborhoods around them were Black, and they were white Baptists. And the last thing he asked me is, I hope you're not going to turn this over to the Black Panther Party or the Nation of Islam. Oh, no. I said, I had created something called the Oakland Community Learning Center. And I discovered to my grief that the Black Panthers were a criminal gang. It always bothered me. We created this church in East Oakland, but the Black community never showed up. It was always, I knew the Panthers because I was working with them. It was always only Panthers. And that's because the Black community knew they were gangsters and killers. But of course we white radicals had contempt for, in a way, it was a contempt for Black people. We just thought, they're not politically sophisticated enough.
Right.
To support murderers and gangsters.
Right.
In retrospect, it seems sort of amusing, but it was very painful at the time. Anyway, I recruited my bookkeeper. I was editing the largest magazine that left. I recruited her to keep the books because I had made it a tax-exempt foundation. And of course, if Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton were white, they'd be in jail for the way they used their 501c3s politically.
Yes.
But in any case, the Panthers wound up murdering this woman. And that was one large step out of the left. The other was when I saw they didn't care about the Vietnamese at all. It's a similar thing here. It's like white radicals don't give a damn about black people. If they did,
Yes.
they'd be really upset by all the homicides in the inner city. And they'd be upset to do something about them, but they're not. There's not one Black Lives Matter martyr that's a young black killed by another young black, because it doesn't fit their political agendas.
Didn't fit their narrative. Yeah.
Anyway, so that's so it's my whole life. This has been my life, and the way I came to do this book, well, I knew immediately that George Floyd was not the victim of a racial killing. And how did I know that? Well, because there were 4 officers who were charged with his murder. One of them is black, who actually a young man who joined the Minneapolis police force to reform it. And the other was Asian. So how does race factor into that equation? It actually doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody noticed that. Nobody said anything about that. To me, you could say a lot of things about the procedure that was used and whatnot. But the one thing you can't say is that it was a racial killing. And yet scores of people, hundreds of cities ravaged by this anger against white cops. Now, the interesting thing is, I think my book is the only place you can find this, except I give a footnote and it will tell you where you can find the video actually of 60 Minutes, but right after the Derek Chauvin trial. And when you think about it, this was a lynching. The whole Black Lives Matter campaign are lynchings. First comes the verdict, then you get maybe the autopsy, then maybe you get an investigation, then you get a trial, and then of course you get the same verdict and the execution, or in his case, 40 years in jail. I mean, that's what a lynch mob means. You start with the verdict, and you don't really care about the facts. If somebody raises the facts, they're a racist or what have you. So Keith Ellison is the Attorney General for the state of Minnesota, and he was interviewed on 60 Minutes shortly after the trial. Now, Keith Ellison spent 11 years as a spokesperson for really the most vicious racist in the country, which is Louis Farrakhan. Farrakhan is a Jew hater, he's a gay basher, he's a white hater, and he hates America. It's a terrible thing when black people, this is one of the real crimes of the left, to turn black people against the country, which they were here. Black people were in this country in the 17th century, for crying out to us, before the vast majority of white people or their ancestors ever got here. So there's nobody really more American than Black America. And yet the left, in its devious ways, has turned good sections of the Black community against their own country. It's really, really terrible. And even the term African American, of course, an Italian American comes from a country. Africa is a continent, and I forget how many languages are spoken. There was a book by a Washington Post, Black Washington Post reporter. He spent 3 years on assignment in Africa. And he said, I have nothing in common with these people.
I remember that book.
Black Americans are Black Americans. That's what they are, Americans first and foremost. Anyway, Keith Ellison spent 11 years as a spokesperson for Louis Farrakhan. And Farrakhan had traveled to Iran to chant with the mullahs, death to America. This guy is some piece of work. And, unfortunately, there's a lot of people who will follow him. So 60 Minutes asked Keith Ellison, he's the chief prosecutor, mind you, on the Derek Chauvin case. He's the guy who set the charges